Welcome! In this series of short videos, we will look at topics common to both the PowerBasic console and Windows compilers. Today, we will look at a library for using text configuration files in your applications. In this series of videos, I'll be covering the creation and use of libraries. So you might ask, why use libraries? Why not just write code whenever you need it? Well, if you're writing a lot of applications, having common libraries that contain functionality that you use often will save you time, both coding and testing. It will also make your code more readable and therefore maintainable, which is always a good thing. When you're creating an application, you may well have configuration information within the source code. This configuration information could be pointing to a shared network folder, or perhaps a database server name and database name. Well, you can store this information within your application, for example within a constant. You can find in many organizations they have both a development, a test and a production environment, and the values of these configuration items could be different in each case. So as a programmer, you then have the dilemma of configuring your application for connecting to the development system, and then having tested it in development, you then have to change the source code in order to pass it over to perhaps other developers or an official testing team. And then when it comes time to move the application into production, the last thing you want to do is to have to recompile it yet again to set it up for the production environment. So an easy solution to this dilemma is to extract the configuration information from your application and place it in an external file. This way, once you have finished developing your application and your executable and perhaps DLLs are complete, the only thing that needs to be changed when you move from the development to the test and then to the production environments is to change your configuration file to point it towards the configuration items for that particular environment. These configuration files could be plain text files, they could be INI files, or they could indeed be XML files. What we're going to look at today is setting up a library for plain text configuration files. Let's have a look at the code. In our include libraries at the top of this application, we have two libraries we have previously used, the File Handling Routines library and the AES-256 encryption library. We're going to be adding a brand new library today, the Text Configuration File library. This configuration text file is going to be a CSV file, comprising of two columns, an item and a value. The first column, the item column, stores the name of the thing we wish to have a configuration value, and the value column stores the actual value. So in our first line we have server, and the server name we are designated is sky_1. We then have a name of a database, the name of a user, the password of a user, and an arbitrary user setting. We're going to create functions to allow us to extract information from this file and to update it. And further on in the video, we're going to show how you can actually encrypt certain items. For example, the password field you wouldn't want to have in free text. And then when you're shipping your application, you'll ship your config.txt file along with the application. These are the functions we're going to be creating today. We will first need a function to load the configuration file. This will load into a global array. We then have a function to get a value from that array. We have another function to put a value into that array, and a final function to save the array back to disk. As this library makes use of some of the routines in the file handling library, that needs to be loaded prior to loading this library. So we're setting up a global string array called text configuration. This is going to be a two-dimensional array. The first element will be the name of the item, and the second element will be the value of that item. So if we're going to be pulling information back from this configuration file, we'll need to set up local variables to store those values. So we've now got local variables for the server, the database, the user, and the password. So we're going to create a function to load our text file into our global array. And we're calling that textconfig load file. It's always useful to have a naming convention for your functions. This avoids having collisions between function names in different libraries, and having a sensibly named function that gives details of what the function is actually going to do is always useful. It makes your code much more readable. So let's create this textconfig load file function. This function takes a single parameter. This is a path and the name of the file, which is our configuration file. To save us writing some code, we're going to reuse one of the functions in our file handling library, the read the CSV file into an array. This makes the writing of this function a single line of code. We're passing the read the CSV file into array function two parameters, the file we wish to load and the array we wish to load it into. So if we try running our code now, it will tell us it has loaded the config file successfully. So now that we've loaded our configuration file, we need a straightforward way to get information out of that file. So we're going to create a new function called textconfig getValue. It will take a single parameter, that being the name of the config item we wish to read. So our first line is going to get the value that's in the str server. That should return sky1. Since we've already loaded the information into an array, we merely have to sweep through the array using a for next loop to look for matches. So we're going to use the for next loop to step through from the first record in our array to the upper bounding of the array. So we're doing a case-independent search in this array. If the value we've passed in actually matches the value that's in the item column, then we will pass back the value we find. And since we have found a match, there's no point in sweeping through any of the rest of the array. We can pass the value back and exit the function at that point. Once we have got each of these values back, we can display them on our log. So we can now see we're getting the config information that exists within the config file. Each of the config items has been returned and displayed on the screen. We haven't yet looked at the user setting one. One of the other uses of configuration files is to save some setting that a user has made while using your application. You can save this to the config file locally for the user so that the next time the user runs the application will remember what the config setting actually is. So our next task is to create a function to allow the user to update the value inside the config file. So what we're going to do is we're going to update the user setting, and we're going to change the value of x to a different value. So we'll need a new function to put a value back into the array. So we're going to create a new function called textconfig putValue. It will look for the user setting and it will change it to ABC. This function will be much like the previous function, only this time we're passing it two variables, the item to look for and the new value to place into that item. So as we did before, we're going through a for next loop to look at every element to see if it finds a match. We're forcing it to lowercase again to ensure our search is case independent. If we do actually find a match, we can then update the value to our new value. And at that point, we can exit the function. If we do not find a match, it will run through to the end of the function, and the value it will return will be a false. However, saving the value to the array will not save it to disk. We'll need to create another function to save our array back to disk. So we're going to create another function in our library called textconfig savefile. It will take a single parameter, which in this case is the path and the name of our config file. And in this function, we're going to make use of an existing library function, save the array to CSV file. This will pass back either a true or false. True if it managed to save the file successfully, or false if it did not. So as we will see in our config file at the moment, we have the value in the user setting column as being X. If we run the application now, it tells us it has saved the config file successfully. So if we look again at our config file, we'll see the value is now ABC. So we have successfully updated the config file in memory and then saved it back to disk. So that handles reading items from our config file and updating them. And after update, we can save the config file back to disk. However, there may be some items within our config file that we don't want left in free text. For example, the password. We need to find a nice easy way of encrypting the data within that field. We have already added our encryption library, the AES256 include file. In order to make use of this library, there are a couple of constants we want to set up. These will allow us to encrypt our strings. First of all, a data password, and then an HMAC password. These passphrases should be as long and as complicated as you need. Ideally, for good encryption, you need a good long set of passphrases. So we're going to add another local variable to the beginning of our PB main function, and this will be our encrypted password. Now, as we know, the password is currently 1234, which is not the best password. We're going to read that in from the config file, we're going to encrypt it, and then we're going to write it back. So since we know the password is coming in and being placed in the str password variable, we can then encrypt that. So we're going to do that by calling two functions in our encrypted library. There's a fun encrypt function which takes three parameters, the password itself and our two passphrases. This function gives a binary encrypted password. Since we want to store this password in our configuration file, it needs to be an ASCII text. So we're using the bin to hex new function to turn it into text, which will store in that file quite nicely. So then we can use the function we've already created, the text config put value, to put this value into the password field. So we're passing it its two parameters, the name of the field we wish to update, in this case password, and the value we want to put into it, the encrypted password. Then we're going to save the configuration file back to disk. So if we try running that now, it saves successfully. And if we have a look at the configuration file, we'll see that we have a new version, and there is our new password. Considerably longer than the value we had before. So now that we have an encrypted value for the password in our configuration file, we need to be able to read that back out of the configuration file so we can use it within our application. So let's for the moment comment out this section where we did the encryption. And now we will decrypt the password and display it on the screen. This can be done very easily. We can set the value of our password variable to be equal to the decryption of our password using the decrypt and the hex to bin values, and our two passphrases. So if we run this now, we should see our original password of 1234 coming out of the file. And there it is. So in summary, what we've achieved today is the ability to create a config text file. This is a standard CSV file that can be maintained either using Notepad or a spreadsheet. We now have a library of a series of functions that allow us to read this file into memory, into an array, and then to read from that array any element we wish. We can also update elements within the array, either to encrypt them, or decrypt them, or to just change the value. We then have a final function to allow us to save the config file back to disk. Putting all this together does give you a mechanism by which you can extract all the config information from your application and place it in a configuration file. This will give you a great deal more flexibility in your applications. But that's it for today. Thank you for watching.